Good morning. You're watching Businessworld Live. I'm Dani Laurel.
And I'm Jess De Los Santos. Here are the biggest stories to kickstart this trading day, Wednesday. Russia's invasion of Ukraine prompts the World Bank to trim its growth forecast for the Philippines this year. Besides geopolitical turmoil, the lender says our country may also face risks from the May 2022 elections.
Nearly 200,000 foreign tourists have arrived in the country since the borders reopened last February. The government expects this number to grow as it seeks the return of South Korean visitors.
The government's economic team expects budget deficit to narrow this year on hopes of higher revenue collections.
And the country's largest labor federation refiles its petition for a 470 peso wage increase in Metro Manila. We begin our broadcast with the World Bank trimming its growth forecast for the Philippines this year.
That's on the back of the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on commodity prices as well as uncertainties from the upcoming presidential elections. The multilateral lender now expects our domestic GDP to expand by 5.7% this 2022 and warns that growth could further slow to 4.9% if conditions in Eastern Europe worsen. The World Bank had penciled a GDP projection of 5.8% this year. For 2023 and 2024, the lender expects Philippine GDP to grow by 5.6% on average. Now, these new projections are below the government's 7 to 9% target for 2022 and 6 to 7% for 2023. The World Bank says the Philippines is vulnerable to the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war since our country is a net importer of oil. Pump prices have surged since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24. Now, on the domestic front, the World Bank says risks may arise from the May 2022 elections, noting that political transition could result in policy discontinuity that may undermine market confidence. Meanwhile, Fitch Solutions retained its 6.5% growth forecast for 2022, noting that the Philippine economy is gaining further traction with easing mobility restrictions.
Now, the Finance Department is expecting the country's budget deficit to start narrowing this year. Finance Chief Sonny Dominguez said borrowings are likely to decline and revenues are likely to rise, saying the economy is strongly rebounding from the pandemic. In yesterday's Philippine economic briefing, BSP Governor Ben Diokno seconded this message. He said there are clear signs of recovery despite the huge impact of the pandemic and the Ukraine-Russia war in the Philippines. Diokno also said they will double their efforts in growing the economy over the last few weeks of the Duterte administration. Dominguez agreed, touting the economic reforms the current administration has already achieved.
Many reform measures that languished for decades on the shelves of Congress were finally enacted into law. The same reforms helped us gain the financial strength to weather the worst of the COVID-19 crisis. Had we not pursued them on time, the impact of the pandemic would have been worse. Our 2020 GDP would have plunged deeper by 13.3% instead of 9.6%. The next administration will inherit many hard-won reforms. They will enter the office with the basic groundwork for rapid growth already in place.
Tourism Secretary Berna Romulo Puyet was also present in that economic briefing. She reported that over 186,000 tourists have arrived in the country since it reopened its borders last February. Earlier, the DOT reported that foreign arrivals have picked up to 18,000 daily this April. The Philippines started accepting foreign tourists from visa-free countries on February 10, and this was expanded to include all vaccinated tourists from all countries on April 1st. Romulo Puyet said the top country of origin among foreign travelers was the U.S., followed by Canada, the United Kingdom, South Korea, and Australia. The government is still seeking a recovery in arrivals from South Korea, which was the Philippines' leading source of tourists pre-pandemic. Fewer South Korean tourists have been visiting the Philippines this year due to a surge in cases in their home country. Now, has the increased tourism activity already spilled over to the hotel industry? Let's ask Benito Bengzon, Executive Director of the Philippine Hotel Owners Association. Good morning, Sir Benito. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, Jester and Danny, and thank you for having me again in your program.
Okay, picking up from that report, Sir Benito, again, the country opened its borders to fully vaccinated tourists April 1. The DOT says we're close to 200,000 tourist arrivals since February. Is this something that the hotel sector is already feeling at the moment? How are hotels doing? Have you seen increased bookings and reservations?
The opening of our borders to inbound foreign tourists is certainly welcome news for the hoteliers because this has helped increase hotel room occupancy and, of course, improve our revenues across the different operating areas of the hotels. Based on the report of the Department of Tourism, there have been 186,000 foreign tourists who entered the country between February 10 and April 4. So this is good news. And perhaps to put things in perspective, this is already a slight increase over the 164,000 foreign tourists that we registered in 2021. So can you just imagine for the whole year of 2021, 164,000, and for the period February 10 to April 4, we already recorded 186,000. But I think it's also important to manage expectations. Before the pandemic, we were doing about 22,500 foreign tourists a day. Right now, we're averaging about 3,500. Certainly, there's still a long way to go, but we're already seeing signs of recovery, and this is good for the hotel industry.
Okay, sir, can you tell us in terms of percentage occupancy, how this compares to pre-pandemic levels, especially since we've had the shift from quarantine facilities into traditional hotels?
Very difficult to compare the occupancy rates pre-pandemic versus the current. Perhaps the more relevant comparison would be the occupancy rates that we recorded after the quarantine requirements were lifted. And as I mentioned previously, many of the hotels suffered tremendously when quarantine requirements were removed. And some of them reported single-digit occupancy rates in the first couple of weeks. But now, many of them have shifted to regular operations. They're starting to get a huge chunk of the leisure market, particularly staycation, field foreigners or balikbayans, and some tourists. So we checked with our members in Cebu, for example, yesterday, and they reported that occupancy is around 35 to 40% for their hotels and the resorts. And here in Manila, basically, it's the same occupancy rate that we've also recorded. Of course, there's still a long way to go, but as I mentioned, we welcome the news of easing of restrictions for inbound tourists.
Okay, now speaking, of course, of that shift from quarantine business to your traditional business, which is leisure and leisure activity, what happened to the quarantine businesses here, especially when it comes to always unsettled bills here? Has that been paid already?
We continue to coordinate very closely with the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration, or OWA. Based on the first release of the DBM, there was about 1.2 billion pesos released to OWA to pay for the accounts receivables of our hotels. There's still a balance of about 500 million that they are waiting for from the DBM. And this is the matter that we will be discussing with OWA. In fact, I will be having a meeting later in the day with the officials from the OWA. But the members are they're starting to be paid already. Some of our members have reported that their accounts receivables have dropped by about 40%. So this is good news. And of course, we take this opportunity to thank those who have helped facilitate the release of the payments. Secretary Dominguez, Secretary Bello, and of course, Administrator Kakdak. We appreciate the assistance that they have extended to us.
Sir, how do we compare with other destinations? Now the world has reopened, so it's not just the Philippines that, that's not an option. That's an option to tourism here. And how do we compare when it comes to openness, quarantine, ease of being able to travel here, amount of flights? And also, sir, to what extent does the policies of China, that is still zero COVID, affecting or impacting what you were hoping to be a recovery year?
There was a webinar organized by the ASEAN Secretariat out of Jakarta just a few weeks ago, and they compared the travel restrictions, no, the inbound travel restrictions among the member states. No? And the good news is that the Philippines is among a handful of member states that have opened up already to foreign tourists. If I remember correctly, they also mentioned Cambodia, Indonesia, and Malaysia. So Philippines will be among the few that have opened up. So we're fairly competitive, quite attractive. The challenge is to make sure that we bring back the flight capacities and the frequencies to pre-pandemic levels. Of course, what we're really waiting for is the influx of tourists coming from our major markets, particularly Korea, China, and Japan, which collectively make up for about 50% of all inbound tourists. In the report that was shared to me yesterday by our partners from Cebu, they were saying that there's already a lot of Westerners, particularly from US and Europe, who are patronizing or not going back to the different resort destinations. But clearly, the bread and butter of many of these properties would be the Northeast Asian market.
Okay. Now, of course, while we are talking about the recovery of the sector, one more pain point, Sir Benito, that you have to address in the sector would have to be the recovery of Odette-devastated areas, particularly in Visayas and Mindanao, specifically Surigao. Have they started rebuilding?
They have started rebuilding. The feedback that we have received so far is that the recovery and rehabilitation efforts are ongoing. And from the point of view of the market, there's still a lot of interest, not only in Siargao, but for many of our resort destinations. So the Philippines continues to position itself very strongly among the beach holiday market or the resort holiday market. So I think this is one particular area where we can continue to leverage on so that the recovery of tourism, particularly inbound tourism, will be accelerated.
Sir, final question. Are you able to provide us with some growth targets already for the year, given these numbers from the Department of Tourism?
Very difficult, still very difficult to come up with the projections. We will have to wait for the movement coming from the other major source markets. Again, particularly the Northeast Asian markets, Korea, China, and Japan. I think the good news, the welcome development is that, again, based on the report of the DOT, 186,000 from February 10 to April 4. So if we're able to sustain this, then we can at least, maybe double or triple the volume that we produced in 2021. But if you look at the projections of the United Nations World Tourism Organization, many of their experts are saying that it will take at least 2 years for us to go back to 2019 levels.
Okay, but still progress definitely on that front, and hoping, of course, for other key markets to be reopening their own economies to be able to help the Philippines benefit as well from tourism. Thank you so much, Benito Bengzon, Executive Director of the Philippine Hotel Owners Association.
Thank you, Jester and Yan.
Now, coming right up after the break, we'll check how airline stocks are moving as more and more tourists are returning to the Philippines.
More of that when Business World Live returns. Stay with us.
You're still watching Business World Live here on One News. I'm Jess De Los Santos.
And I'm Danny Laurel.
Flocking back to our shores here, Dan. How is that moving the sector?
Have many listed stocks of the hotel industry, but what we do have as an indicator are airlines. And take a look at this. Well, nevertheless, I do have to caveat that a lot of our stocks are in the red this morning. Cebu Pacific particularly is down by 1%. You do have PAL unchanged, and Macro Asia is also down by 0.2%. Now, this comes as Cebu Pacific even said that it has sufficient cash to support operations at least for the next 18 months. It has about 18.14 billion pesos in cash as of December 31, 2021, and they said that this is sufficient. Another good thing here, Jess, is they're looking at increasing the number of their employees this year by about 600 more employees from 3,046 last year. They're also, of course, aiming to restore 100% of pre-pandemic domestic capacity this month. Now, this comes, of course, as let's take a look at how our index is moving this morning. You can see on my terminal here, again, it's the same story as what we saw yesterday. Everyone in the red, moving forward, moving even further down, going back to those 7,000 levels, which is, of course, our psychological level here, even as the mining and oil counter, again, is the only one in the green. Now, let's take a step back at the index and just see which ones are the two standouts here. We only have just Globe Telecom and Emperador currently enjoying a few gains compared to the rest of the index that we're seeing in the red.
And energy stocks have also been in focus since the war broke out in Ukraine. And fresh sanctions are in the offing here. What's the latest, Dan?
All right. Well, as you mentioned, fresh sanctions in the offing here. You do have the European Union proposing a ban on coal, especially in Russia, after, of course, apparent war crimes that are happening over in Ukraine. And take a look at coal as a commodity. It's now trading at 281 in terms of coal here. And that is actually the highest that we've seen, 13-year high, especially in Asia, all-time high. And one stock, of course, that will possibly benefit from this is Semirara. And as you can see, it's trading now up 70 centavos. That's up by 2 3/10%. They do produce coal here, and they have been enjoying gains since the beginning of the year. Now, the bright side to this, Jess, is that there is a more pressing need for renewable energy. And we can see here the list of firms. More and more firms are becoming involved in renewable energy. You have the Citicorp REIT, which came in just this year. You also have SPNEC or Solar Philippines Nueva Ecija, and they might actually be active as Meralco is now reopening 850 megawatts capacity for bidding after it did not receive offers from Terra Solar. And let's take a look at how the performance is. Unfortunately, I do have to report that apart from SPNEC, which is up by 0.5%, the rest of even our solar energy players are suffering and bearing the brunt of another slide, which is broad-based, Jess.
Here are the other headlines we're keeping our eyes on. The country's largest labor federation refiled its petition for a 470 peso increase in daily wage for Metro Manila. This comes after the Wage Board rejected their earlier petition, citing issues in jurisdiction. The NCR Regional Tripartite Wages and Productivity Board had ruled that it has no authority to impose an across-the-board wage increase. That's why in its new petition, the Trade Union Congress of the Philippines has removed the term across the board, which was noted in their initial filing. The group reiterated the same reasons for wage increase cited in their previous petition. In a statement, the UCP said that if the Wage Board dismisses its petition again, it will keep refiling its plea.
Ito'y klarong-klarong pruweba ng insincerity ng DOLE leadership at ang insincerity ni Secretary Pelio. Kalma lang tayo dahil nagkaroon ng spike dun sa presyo ng crudo. At ngayon na medyo kumakalma daw, ay mukhang inuurong nila yung kanilang tinutulak na wage board review. So, niloko ho tayo, nilaro ho tayo, sabi nila, inaaral nila at mamadaliin. Yun pala, ibabasura.
Now, Agriculture Secretary William Dar says there have been no problems with the country's food supply during the pandemic. But Dar admits affordability was an issue for the poor and other Filipinos whose livelihoods were disrupted by the public health crisis. Dar said that the next administration must pursue its own projects with an eye towards improving productivity and achieving sustainability. He also recommended to increase the funding devoted to agriculture to a level at par with the region.
BSP Governor Ben Jokno says the central bank is ready to take preemptive action to tame inflation risks. Jokno believes that the March CPI of 4% suggests that inflation will likely be elevated in the coming months, although he said that the BSP will continue to be patient and will consider a rate hike adjustment by the second half of 2022. For Union Bank Chief Economist Carlo Asuncion, a preemptive rate hike could do more good than harm as it will tame the actual rise in prices. Meanwhile, Security Bank Chief Economist Dan Roses said non-monetary measures like fuel subsidies and wider food imports are crucial to respond to inflationary pressures. In other news, National Task Force Against COVID-19 Special Advisor Ted Herbosa clarifies no specific amount of COVID-19 vaccines in the country have expired. Speaking with a big story, Herbosa explained that the government has no way of knowing which vaccines have been utilized by LGUs and which ones have been donated to neighboring countries like Myanmar and Papua New Guinea.
We can't say there's really that amount that's expiring because we don't know what have been utilized and given by the different regions and local governments. So in fact, we're doing what's called a wall-to-wall inventory of what is left and their true expiry date, so we will know what is at hand.
In an interview with the chief's infectious disease expert, Ronjin Solante also said that the shelf life of vaccines can be extended upon the approval of manufacturers. Although Solante claimed that it would still be better if more Filipinos are encouraged to get vaccinated ASAP.
There are shelf life that in a vaccine na pwede mo pa siyang isagad, no? I-extend, no? And that should be coming from the vaccine company if they will allow that, okay? So if they will allow like extension of 3 months or six months, then that's acceptable as long as the necessary storage was maintained during that time.
And that's a first look into the business day this Wednesday, April 6, 2022. Join us again tomorrow at exactly 9:30 a.m. You can also catch us on Signal Play. Register for a free account now at www.signalplay.com and stream One News live anytime, anywhere. I'm Jess De Los Santos.
And I'm Danny Laurel. Mask on, wash hands, stay safe, Philippines. We are One News.